They called her the rejected Omega before they even said her name. Jade had known this day was coming, the day the pack gathered to name, out loud, what she already believed about herself. No bond mark, no gift. Only a girl who healed broken-winged things nobody else bothered to save, standing in a borrowed silver dress while her own mother looked away. We release you from the promise of a place among us. So she ran, not toward anything, only away into a black tangle of forest that did not belong to her pack, where the moonlight fractured through the branches and her own breath became the loudest sound in the world. She did not know yet that this forest belonged to someone, or that its trees would lead her, before the night was through, to two small trembling creatures hidden beneath an old oak's roots, lost, unwanted, exactly like her. She gathered them close without a second thought. It was the only thing she had ever been good at, after all, keeping the broken, discarded things the world had decided not to want. She did not know, kneeling there in the dark with her arms full of someone else's strays, that the ground beneath her had already begun to notice her. That somewhere beyond the tree line, something ancient had caught her scent and gone very, very still. That night, an Alpha King came looking for whatever had wandered into his territory uninvited. He found her instead, and everything that followed, he would later say, he had never once regretted. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The great hall smelled of pine smoke and old stone, and beneath it, faintly, of fear. Jade's own, sweating cold beneath the borrowed silver dress her mother had insisted she wear. She stood at the center of the circle the way she had stood there every year since she turned 16, waiting for the council to speak the words that would decide, once again, whether she belonged. Around her, the pack had gathered in their usual half-moon, torches guttering against the high windows, and for a long moment, nobody said anything at all. That silence was worse, somehow, than any insult could have been. It gave her too much time to feel the eyes crawling over her bare wrist, searching for a mark that had never once appeared there. Her sister Talia stood near the front, sleeve pushed up just enough to let the pale silver bond mark catch the torchlight. She did not mean to be cruel by wearing it so plainly. Jade told herself that, the way she told herself many things to survive an evening like this, but the shine of it still landed like a slap. Elder Corwin stepped forward first, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. 19 winters and still no bond, no gift declared. The girl heals sparrows and feeds strays behind the kennels while her sister trains for the front line. A ripple of low laughter moved through the crowd, quiet enough to pretend it hadn't happened, loud enough that Jade heard every note of it. She kept her chin level. It was the only thing she still had control over. We cannot keep a place at the fire for someone who brings nothing to the fire, Corwin went on, and it was not unkind exactly. That was somehow the worst part, the way he said it like a fact of weather, like something that simply was, the way frost simply came in winter. The pack thanks you for your years here, Jade, but we release you from the promise of a place among us. Released. As if she were a debt finally paid off. As if 19 years of trying to earn a home could be settled in a single sentence. Her mother's eyes found hers across the circle, and for one unbearable heartbeat, Jade thought she might speak, might step forward, might say no, wait, she is mine, she is ours. But her mother only pressed her lips together and looked away, the way people look away from something they have already grieved. That, more than the elder's words, was what finally cracked something loose in Jade's chest. She did not remember deciding to move. She only remembered the sudden coolness of the corridor air against her flushed face, the torches blurring past her like streaks of gold, and then the night itself opening around her as she pushed through the great doors and did not stop. Behind her, someone called her name. Talia, maybe, though it was hard to tell over the pounding of her own pulse. She did not turn back. There was nothing behind her worth turning back for, not tonight. And the forest ahead swallowed the sound of the hall entirely, replacing torchlight with moonlight and laughter with the hush of wind moving through high branches. She ran until her lungs burned, until the silver dress tore at the hem on brambles she did not bother to avoid, until the trees grew close enough together that the world narrowed to nothing but breath and root and shadow. Only then did she slow, chest heaving, and press a hand flat against the rough bark of an old oak to keep herself upright. It was in that stillness that she heard it, a small, wet, unmistakable sound of distress, coming from somewhere low in the undergrowth to her left. She should have kept walking. She was cold and lost, and her feet were bleeding through thin slippers never meant for forest floors. But some old habit, older than tonight's humiliation, pulled her toward the sound instead of away from it, the way it always had. Ever since she was a child bringing home broken-winged birds her mother scolded her for feeding. What she found in the hollow beneath the oak's roots made her breath catch for an entirely different reason. Two small creatures huddled together in the leaf litter, no bigger than kittens, with soft rounded ears too large for their faces and fur that seemed to shift color faintly in the moonlight. Silver, then something closer to lavender, then silver again, like moonlight caught in water. Their eyes were enormous, dark, and rimmed with a strange constellation of pale freckles across their small snouts. One of them let out a thin, hiccuping cry and pressed itself against the other, and both flinched hard when Jade knelt beside them. Hey, it's all right, she murmured, the way she had murmured to 100 frightened creatures before, voice low and steady, even though her own heart was still racing from everything that had come before this moment. I'm not going to hurt you. She had never seen anything quite like them. Not fox, not wolf pup, not any creature the pack's bestiaries described. Their small paws had a faint webbing between the toes, useful, she guessed, for climbing wet roots or slipping through streams, and a soft ridge of fur ran down each spine that seemed to catch and hold the moonlight like dew on a spiderweb. Whatever they were shivering, and hungry, and entirely alone out here. Which in that moment made them the only creatures in the world Jade felt she understood completely. No one wanted you either, huh? She said softly, and the ache in her own chest eased just slightly at the shared, unspoken understanding passing between them. She gathered them carefully into the fold of her torn dress, feeling twin heartbeats flutter fast and light against her palms. And it was only as she rose to her feet, cradling them close, that she noticed how far the moonlight had begun to change around her, deepening, thickening, gathering at the edges of the clearing like something with weight and intention. Somewhere beyond the tree line, low and resonant, a sound rolled through the forest that was not quite a howl and not quite a horn call. It vibrated in her chest before her ears fully registered it, ancient and commanding, and every instinct she had ever possessed went suddenly, sharply still. She was no longer alone in these woods, and whatever had just announced itself among the trees was far, far too large to be another lost stray. The sound came again, closer this time, and Jade felt it more than heard it. A low vibration that seemed to move up through the soles of her ruined slippers and settle somewhere behind her ribs. The two small creatures in her arms pressed themselves tighter against her, and one of them, the smaller of the pair, let out a soft, chirruping whimper that sounded almost like a question. Shh, shh, I know, she whispered, though she did not know at all. Not really. She only knew that every instinct honed by 19 years of pack life was telling her that whatever moved beyond the tree line was not something a lone, unmarked wolf girl should be standing in a clearing waiting to meet. And yet her feet did not carry her away. They carried her forward, one careful step at a time, drawn by something she could not name. Not courage exactly, and not recklessness either, but something closer to the way she had always moved toward wounded, frightened things instead of away from them. The trees thinned ahead into a wider clearing washed silver with moonlight, and there, at its center, stood a wolf the size of a small horse, fur black as the space between stars, eyes burning the same deep amber as the pair she still cradled against her chest. He did not move toward her. He simply watched, still as carved stone, and the sheer weight of his attention made the humiliation of the great hall feel suddenly very far away and very small. Jade's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. She had grown up on stories of the Alpha King who ruled these woods, cruel in some tellings, cold in others, always distant, always dangerous. But nothing in those stories had prepared her for the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath around him now. "You're trespassing," he said, and his voice, low and rough, seemed to come from everywhere at once, though his massive jaws had not moved. It took her a moment to understand. He was speaking mind to mind, the old way, the way only the strongest alphas ever learned. This territory does not welcome strays. The word landed harder than he likely intended. Strays. She had been called that once already tonight, in gentler language, by people who were supposed to love her. "I didn't mean to cross into your land," she said aloud, voice steadier than she felt, lifting her chin the same way she had in the great hall only an hour before. "I was running from somewhere that didn't want me either. I'll leave if that's what you need. She glanced down at the small trembling shapes in her arms. "I found them first. I couldn't just leave them here." Something shifted in the great wolf's amber eyes at that. The faintest flicker of surprise quickly smoothed away. He took one slow step closer, then another, until his massive head was near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his dark fur, and near enough, too, that she could see the small creatures in her arms go very still, watching him with those enormous freckled eyes, more curious now than afraid. He lowered his great head and inhaled once, carefully, near the bundle of fur cradled against her. "Sprites," he said, and something in his mental voice had softened just slightly. "Moon Hollow sprites. I have not seen one born in this territory in a generation." "Moon Hollow sprites," Jade repeated softly, testing the name, looking down at the two small faces blinking up at her. The larger of the pair had fur just a shade darker than its sibling, more silver than lavender, and a small crooked patch over one eye that gave it a permanently curious expression. "This one keeps trying to climb into my sleeve," she added, half to herself, feeling an unexpected, unfamiliar warmth loosen something tight in her chest. "I think I'll call him Cedar." The smaller one, all soft lavender and enormous eyes, had gone very quiet and simply stared up at the huge black wolf without blinking, as though it had never in its short life seen anything quite so large or so strange. "And this one," Jade murmured. "Dew, I think." "She looks like a dew." The Alpha King made a low sound in his throat that might, in a wolf far less imposing, have been mistaken for amusement. "Moon Hollow sprites are not simply lost creatures," he said, straightening, his amber eyes moving from the small bundles back to Jade's face with an intensity that made her pulse skip. "They are drawn to places of true safety, to people the land itself has judged worthy of trust. They do not wander into just anyone's arms." Jade felt heat climb her throat, unsure whether it was embarrassment or something else entirely. "I don't feel very worthy of anything tonight," she admitted before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted how much of her raw evening had spilled out in 6 small words. The great wolf was quiet for a long moment, studying her in a way that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely seen, not measured against a sister's silver mark, not weighed and found lacking, just seen. "Whoever decided that," he said finally, low and certain, "was wrong." Before Jade could find any response to that, a fresh sound broke the stillness of the clearing, this one small, sharp, and unmistakably distressed, coming from somewhere in the brush behind the black wolf. He turned his great head sharply toward it, ears pricked, and in the space of a breath, 3 more shapes came tumbling out of the undergrowth in a chaotic scramble of paws and fur. They were sprites too, unmistakably. The same shifting silver lavender coats, the same oversized ears. But where Cedar and Dew had been quiet and shy, these 3 arrived in a tangle of noise, one of them tripping over its own oversized paws and rolling twice before popping back up as though nothing had happened at all. "There's more of them," Jade breathed, wonder momentarily overtaking exhaustion and heartbreak alike, watching as the trio scrambled straight past the enormous Alpha King without the faintest trace of fear, and made a beeline for her skirts instead. "It seems," the Alpha King said. And this time there was no mistaking the low rumble of something almost like amusement in his mental voice, "that the forest has decided something about you tonight as well." One of the newcomers, round-bellied and missing a small chunk from one large ear, climbed determinedly up the torn hem of her dress and settled itself in the crook of her elbow with an air of complete finality, as though the matter of where it belonged had never truly been in question. "That one doesn't let go once he's decided," the Alpha King observed, watching with an expression Jade couldn't quite read. "You may as well name him too." She looked down at the small, stubborn, thoroughly pleased creature now tucked against her arm, and something in her chest, something that had felt hollowed out and discarded only an hour ago in the Great Hall, began, very quietly, to fill back in. "Thorn," she decided softly. "I'll call him Thorn." Above her, the Alpha King went very still, watching the small family gathering itself into her arms with a focus that made her wonder, not for the first time that night, exactly what kind of law she had wandered into the middle of, and what it might mean that he had not, even once, told her to leave. Morning arrived in the Alpha King's territory the way Jade imagined. Mornings arrived in places that had never once doubted themselves. Golden, unhurried, entirely too confident. She woke to it slowly, blinking against a shaft of light falling through an unfamiliar window, and for one disoriented moment forgot exactly why her whole body ached, and why something small and warm was snoring directly into her ear. Then she remembered everything, and groaned quietly into the pillow. "You're awake," said a voice from somewhere near the foot of the bed, dry as old parchment. "Good. I was beginning to think we'd acquired a very decorative corpse." Jade sat up fast enough to dislodge 2 sprites from where they'd nested in the blankets, and found herself facing a woman not much older than her own mother. Silver-streaked hair braided back severely, arms crossed, standing in the doorway with the particular expression of someone who had already had a very long day, and it was not yet mid-morning. "I'm sorry, who—" "Marin. I run this household, such as it is, and apparently now also run a rescue for whatever the king drags in off the forest floor." Marin's sharp eyes swept the bed, taking in the small tangle of sprites still half asleep among the sheets, and something in her stern expression flickered, just briefly, into something softer before she caught herself and smoothed it away again. 5 of them. 5. "Do you have any notion what sprites eat, girl? Because I assure you, His Majesty did not think that far ahead when he carried you all in here at dawn looking like he'd personally rescued the moon from a well." Jade felt her face heat. "He carried me?" "You'd fallen asleep sitting up against a tree root with an armful of sprites and refused to wake when spoken to." "What would you call it?" Marin's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Come, eat something before you fall over again. The castle's seen enough dramatics for 1 week without you adding to the pile." The kitchen, when Jade found it, trailing sprites like an unlikely comet's tail, turned out to be enormous, warm, and presided over by a broad-shouldered man named Osric, who took one look at the small creatures scrambling across his scrubbed work table and let out a bellow that shook the copper pots hanging overhead. "Off! Off my counters, you little moon rats! I only just—" He stopped mid-sentence as Thorn, entirely unbothered, planted himself directly in the middle of a cooling tray of honey biscuits and looked up with an expression of profound, shameless satisfaction. Osric's outrage deflated somewhat. Well, at least eat the burnt ones. I was going to give those to the hounds. He likes you, Jade offered, trying not to laugh at the war being fought across Osric's weathered face between genuine irritation and the plain fact that his hand was already reaching to scratch behind Thorne's oversized ear. He likes my biscuits, Osric corrected gruffly, though the correction lacked real conviction. There's a difference. Sit, girl, before Marin has both our heads for letting you go hungry in the king's own kitchen. It was, Jade thought, taking a seat at the long, worn table, while sprites scattered themselves across the bench like an unruly royal court in miniature. An entirely stranger morning than she had ever expected to have. And somehow, despite everything, the first one in longer than she could remember where nobody had looked at her like she was something to be managed or excused. She found the Alpha King an hour later in a courtyard she hadn't known existed, standing over a long table covered in maps and ledgers, looking considerably less like a moonlit forest spirit, and considerably more like a man who had been arguing about grain taxes since before sunrise and was losing patience with it. Absolutely not, he was saying to a broad, heavily scarred wolf shifter beside him, voice clipped in a way it hadn't been in the clearing the night before. We are not raising the eastern border tithe again this season. The southern packs are still recovering from the flooding. With respect, Your Majesty, the Treasury doesn't much care whose fields flooded. Then the Treasury can explain that to 700 hungry children personally, Garrick, and I will happily arrange the meeting. His tone was flat enough that the scarred man, Garrick, actually took half a step back, muttering something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like stubborn as his father before stalking off toward the far gate. The Alpha King exhaled hard through his nose, rubbed at his temple with 2 fingers, and only then noticed Jade standing at the courtyard's edge, 5 sprites arranged around her feet in various states of investigating the paving stones. Something in his expression shifted. Not soft exactly. He did not strike her as a man who did soft easily, but the sharp edges eased, just slightly. You're still here, he said, and it wasn't quite a question. You didn't tell me to leave, Jade said. I took that as an oversight I shouldn't correct on your behalf. That earned her the faintest huff of something that might, on a more generous day, have been called a laugh. Careful. Keep making jokes like that, and my council will decide you're a bad influence. Your council already decided I'm trespassing. I don't think there's much further down to fall. He studied her for a long moment, and Jade had the distinct sense of being weighed against something she couldn't see. Some private ledger of his own, separate from the one covered in grain figures on the table between them. Ferdinand, he said finally. What? My name. If you're going to stand in my courtyard trading barbs with me in front of half my household, you may as well use it instead of whatever formal nonsense the stories back in your pack probably taught you. Jade, she offered in return, and felt strangely, absurdly pleased when he repeated it back, testing the shape of it the way she'd tested the sprites' names the night before. A commotion at the edge of the courtyard interrupted whatever might have come next. Cedar, it turned out, had discovered the fountain, and Dew had discovered that Cedar, discovering the fountain, was the single funniest thing to happen in her short life, and the resulting splashing had soaked the hem of a passing servant's robes thoroughly enough that the poor woman let out a shriek that brought half the courtyard running. They're not usually this chaotic, Jade said weakly, watching Thorne attempt, and fail, to climb the fountain's edge with all the dignity of a creature entirely convinced of its own competence. I've lived a very long time, Jade, Ferdinand said, dry amusement warring with something more genuine underneath it as he watched the small disaster unfold. I have never once heard anyone say that sentence and have it turn out to be true. It was Marin, later that afternoon, who found Jade sitting on the low garden wall with Dew curled asleep in her lap, and settled herself down beside her with the particular heaviness of someone who intended to say something and wanted comfortable seating first. You should know, Marin said without preamble, that not everyone in this castle will be glad to see you here. Jade kept her eyes on the garden, on the two sprites. She still hadn't named the last pair, chasing a moth in lazy, looping circles above the hedges. I imagine an unmarked, unmatched wolf turning up out of nowhere isn't exactly cause for celebration among a king's council. It isn't the unmarked part that worries them. Marin's voice had lost its earlier dryness, gone careful instead. It's that His Majesty hasn't looked at anyone the way he looked at you last night in more years than I care to count. Some people will find that a threat before they find it a comfort. Garrick, for one. Good man, loyal to a fault, but he's spent a decade trying to talk that boy into a match with the Ashvale pack for the sake of the Eastern Alliance. He won't be pleased to see those plans complicated by a stray he didn't approve first. I'm not trying to complicate anyone's alliance, Jade said, feeling suddenly, sharply exposed, as though the whole strange warmth of the morning had been a private thing she'd let slip too far into the light. I didn't say you were. Marin's hand landed briefly, unexpectedly gentle on Jade's shoulder. I said you should know. There's a difference between a warning and an accusation, girl. Same as there's a difference between a king who rules with his teeth bared and one who rules trying, however badly some days, to be kind. Ferdinand is the second sort. Doesn't mean everyone around him is. Jade turned that over in her mind, watching Dew's small chest rise and fall against her palm, the two unnamed sprites finally tiring of their moth and tumbling into a heap in the grass together. What are they called? She asked instead, nodding toward the pair, grateful for a question with a simpler answer. The two that haven't wandered over to me yet? Marin snorted. That's your doing to finish, not mine. Sprites don't answer to names given by just anyone. You'll notice Osric's biscuits didn't win over the whole lot. Only the one bold enough to steal from a stranger's tray on his first morning alive in a new place. That's not luck. That's the land agreeing with something in you. She rose, brushing off her skirts, expression softening into something almost fond despite herself. Name the last two whenever they let you close enough. No rush. Good things rarely need rushing. It's usually only the bad ones in a hurry. She left Jade there in the fading afternoon light, sprites curled sleepily around her, the distant sound of Ferdinand's voice still audible from the courtyard, sharp again with some new argument over the map table. And for the first time since the Great Hall's torches had blurred past her in flight, Jade allowed herself to wonder, quietly, cautiously, whether unwanted might not be the only word left to describe what she was. It was, she thought, watching the two nameless sprites finally uncurl and creep hesitantly toward her outstretched hand, entirely possible that the forest, and perhaps its king, had a different word in mind. The last two sprites took 11 days to trust her enough to be named, which Jade privately considered fair, given that it had taken her 19 years to trust anyone at all. They finally came to her during a rainstorm, a real one, the kind that turned the courtyard fountain into a small, furious river and sent every sensible creature in the castle scurrying for cover. Jade had been curled in the window seat of the small tower room Marin had grudgingly assigned her. Grudgingly being Marin's general register for every kindness she offered, Jade was learning, the way some people apologized before doing something generous, watching lightning forks silver across the tree line when she heard scratching at the door. The two remaining sprites stood there, soaked through, shivering, staring up at her with an expression of such profound betrayal at the weather's existence that Jade laughed out loud before she could stop herself. Oh, come here, you absolute disasters. They came. Of course they came. And by the time she'd toweled them dry by the fire, one had fallen promptly asleep tucked into the collar of her nightgown, small and warm against her collarbone, while the other sat bolt upright on the hearthstones with the fierce, unblinking focus of a creature convinced the fire might attempt something if left unsupervised. You're a worrier, she told the second one, watching it track every pop and shift of the flames with grave suspicion. I'll call you Fern, and you? She glanced down at the sleepy weight against her throat. You don't seem worried about anything at all. Saffron, then. Fern made a small, dignified sound of acceptance, as though the name had simply confirmed something it already knew about itself. Saffron did not stir. 5 names, 5 small lives that had, apparently, decided somewhere in the space of 11 days that the ground beneath her feet was safe ground. Jade sat with that thought a long while after the fire burned low, turning it over the way she'd once turned over injured birds in her palms. Carefully, disbelievingly, as though too much handling might undo the fragile fact of it. Ferdinand found her the next morning in the castle's east garden, kneeling in damp soil with dirt to her elbows and a look of fierce concentration on her face that made him stop just inside the gate and watch a moment before announcing himself. "I was told," he said finally, "that you'd commandeered half of Osric's kitchen garden." Commandeered is a strong word. Jade didn't look up, carefully separating a tangle of struggling seedlings that someone, clearly not a gardener, had planted far too close together. "I'm helping. These would have choked each other out by midsummer. And you know this how? I spent 19 years being told I wasn't good for fighting, or leading, or bonding, or apparently existing correctly in any way the council found useful." She glanced up at him, dirt smudged across one cheekbone, and there was an edge under the dry humor that hadn't fully healed, wouldn't for a while yet. "Turns out when nobody wants you underfoot in the important rooms, you learn a great deal about the rooms nobody else bothers with. Gardens, kennels, sick beds, the unglamorous corners where broken things go to either die quietly or get better." Ferdinand crouched down across from her, careful of his fine coat in the damp earth in a way that made Jade suspect he did not, generally, crouch in gardens. That this, too, was some small unspoken concession being made without ceremony. "My father used to say something similar," he said after a moment, voice quieter than his usual courtyard cadence. "That the health of a kingdom isn't measured at the high table. It's measured in the corners nobody important bothers to visit." A shadow crossed his face, there and gone. He wasn't always good at living by it, but he believed it. "Was," Jade repeated softly, catching the tense. 6 years now." Ferdinand's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Long enough that most of my council has stopped expecting me to grieve him and started expecting me to simply be him, minus whatever they consider his mistakes. It's a peculiar kind of pressure, being asked to be a ghost's better draft." Jade sat back on her heels, seedling forgotten in her palm. "That sounds lonely." "It is." He said it plainly without self-pity, the way a man states a fact about weather. Being feared is easy, once you're used to the shape of it. Being known is considerably harder to arrange when everyone around you has decided in advance what you're supposed to be. "I wouldn't know," Jade said, with a small crooked smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nobody's ever bothered deciding what I'm supposed to be. Rather, the opposite problem." Ferdinand's amber eyes settled on her with an intensity that made her suddenly, sharply aware of how close he was crouched, of the faint scent of cedar and rain still clinging to him from the storm the night before, of the seedling going forgotten and slightly crushed in her closed fist. "I don't think that's entirely true," he said low. "I think you decided what you were, a long time before any of them did, somewhere in the years they spent looking past you." His gaze flicked, briefly, deliberately, to the small green shoots she'd been so carefully untangling. "I think you decided to be someone who mends things, whether anyone was watching or not." The garden was very quiet. Somewhere behind them, Fern was noisily interrogating a garden slug, and Saffron had fallen asleep in a sunny patch of turned earth, and none of it mattered half so much, in that moment, as the 6 inches of damp air between Jade's face and Ferdinand's. He was the one who broke it first, clearing his throat and rising with the abruptness of a man reminding himself of several important reasons not to lean any closer. "Council session in an hour. Garrick will have my head if I arrive smelling of garden dirt and unresolved feelings." "Unresolved feelings," Jade repeated, arching an eyebrow despite the heat climbing her own throat. About the Eastern tithe, Ferdinand said, entirely too smoothly, already retreating toward the gate. Obviously, she agreed, and did not miss the small, satisfied curve of his mouth as he disappeared through the archway. The council session, as it happened, did not go smoothly, and word of exactly why traveled through the castle with the particular speed reserved for gossip too delicious to sit on. Garrick, it emerged, had used the session to formally reintroduce the proposed alliance with the Ashvale pack, an alliance that would, conveniently, involve Ferdinand's betrothal to Lady Ilsevet Ashvale, heir to one of the largest territories bordering the eastern woods. "It is not personal, Your Majesty," Garrick had apparently said in front of the full council, in a tone that suggested he was fully aware of how personal it would sound regardless. "It is arithmetic. The Ashvale lands would secure our eastern border for a generation. Whatever distraction has recently taken up residence in the castle does not change that arithmetic." Marin relayed this to Jade over the kitchen table that evening with the flat, careful delivery of someone choosing her words with unusual precision. "He's not wrong, mind you. Not about the arithmetic. Garrick's loyal and stubborn, and he genuinely believes he's protecting this kingdom the only way he knows how. That doesn't make him kind about it. Doesn't make him cruel either. Just makes him a man who's decided the safety of 700 fields is worth more than one king's happiness, and hasn't much patience left over for questioning that math." Jade pushed a spoon around her bowl, appetite gone. "And Ferdinand? What did he say?" "Told the council," Marin said, and here, finally, a small, sharp gleam of pride broke through her careful neutrality. That his father spent 30 years letting other men do his choosing for him, in matters of the heart and matters of state both, and that he'd buried that man 6 years past and had no intention of being buried the same way while still breathing. Told Garrick the eastern border could be secured with treaties and trade, same as with marriage vows, and that he'd sooner spend the next decade negotiating both than spend one lifetime bound to a woman he's met exactly twice. That doesn't sound like it went over well. It went over about as well as you'd expect a king telling his most trusted advisor no in front of the full council, Marin said dryly. "Which is to say, poorly, loudly, and not for the last time, I'd wager." She reached across the table, and for once didn't disguise the gentleness in the gesture, squeezing Jade's hand briefly before withdrawing it. "But he said it, girl. Nobody made him. That's worth noting, whatever comes of it." Later that night, Jade stood at her tower window long after the castle had gone quiet, 5 sprites arranged around her in various states of sleep, watching torchlight move along the far wall where, she guessed, the council chamber's argument was likely still smoldering in someone's temper even now. She thought of Ferdinand crouched in the garden dirt, ruining a fine coat to talk to her about roots and choices. She thought of Garrick's careful, unkind arithmetic and found she couldn't fully hate him for it, could only recognize, uncomfortably, the shape of a man trying to protect something the only way fear had ever taught him how. Nobody here, she was beginning to understand, was entirely one thing. Not villain, not saint. Only people, layered and complicated and doing their best or their worst depending on the hour. Much, she suspected, like everyone she'd left behind in the pack that no longer wanted her, and much, perhaps, like the girl she was slowly becoming in this strange, unfamiliar castle that somehow, impossibly, was starting to feel less like borrowed shelter and more like something dangerously close to home. Word of the sprite's existence had inevitably spread beyond the castle walls, and with it came the first real trouble Jade hadn't seen coming. Not from Garrick, not from the council, but from a merchant caravan that arrived at the eastern gate a week later with an offer that made her blood run cold the moment Marin relayed it. 200 gold pieces, Marin said, arms crossed, mouth set in a thin line of disgust. For a breeding pair. The man claims Moon Hollow fur fetches a fine price among certain collectors in the southern courts. Says he'd take all 5 off your hands for a proper sum, no questions asked, and everyone walks away satisfied. Jade felt something cold and sharp rise in her chest, fast enough to steal her breath. Thorn, curled in her lap as he so often was these days, seemed to sense the shift in her mood and pressed closer against her stomach with a small, anxious cheer-up. "They're not livestock," she said, low and furious. "They're not fur. Where is he?" "Already turned away from the gate," Marin said. And something in her voice, grim satisfaction layered thin over real anger, suggested the turning away had not been entirely gentle. His Majesty happened to be riding the perimeter when the man made his offer to the gate guard. I understand the conversation was brief. It was Osric, oddly, who filled in the rest of the story that evening, delivering it between chopping vegetables with rather more force than the vegetables strictly required. Brief is one word for it. His Majesty informed the man, and I quote near enough, that any further attempt to purchase, trap, or otherwise acquire a Moon Hollow sprite within his territory would be treated the same as an attempt on the life of a citizen under his protection, and that the penalty for the latter tends to be considerably less pleasant than a refund. He set down the knife, glanced at Jade, and his gruff face softened slightly. Man left rather quickly after that, didn't even collect his deposit from the innkeeper. Jade should have felt relieved. Mostly she did. But underneath the relief sat something more complicated. The uncomfortable knowledge that the world beyond this castle's walls still saw cedar and dew and thorn and fern and saffron as things to be priced and traded. The same careless calculus that had once decided she herself wasn't worth keeping. She found Ferdinand later in the small library off the map room, still in his riding clothes, a cup of something gone cold on the desk beside him, staring at nothing in particular. "Thank you," she said quietly from the doorway. He looked up, and for a moment the sharp edges he wore so easily around the council softened into something rawer. "You don't need to thank me for refusing to sell out 5 creatures who trust you enough to sleep against your throat every night, Jade. That's not a kindness. That's the bare minimum of not being a monster." "You'd be surprised how many people manage to fall short of the bare minimum," she said, coming further into the room, "when there's gold on the table." "I wouldn't, actually." Something bitter passed behind his eyes. "My father took a very similar offer once, years ago. Different creatures, similar principle. Something rare and harmless that wandered into our territory, and a foreign lord offering enough gold to fund an entire season's grain stores. He took the deal. Told the council it was simple arithmetic, same as Garrick's argument about Ilsevet. He turned the cold cup slowly between his hands. I was young enough then to think it was reasonable, old enough now to understand it was a small, quiet kind of cruelty, dressed up in numbers so nobody had to look directly at what it actually was. "You're not him," Jade said softly. "I'm trying very hard not to be," Ferdinand said. And there was something almost raw in the honesty of it, an admission that cost him something to make. Some days that's easier than others. Garrick keeps reminding me, not unkindly, that a king who leads with his heart too often ends up leading his people into ruin. He's not entirely wrong to worry. My father led with something other than his heart for 30 years, and I watched exactly how much that cost the people who trusted him. He set the cup down finally, meeting her eyes. "I don't know yet which kind of king I'll turn out to be, Jade. I only know I'd rather fail trying to be the kind who refuses to sell out small, trusting things for gold than succeed at being the kind who doesn't." The room felt very small and very warm all at once. Jade crossed to the desk, close enough now that she could see the tired lines at the corners of his eyes. The particular exhaustion of a man who carried more than any single person should reasonably be asked to carry. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're already failing to be him, in all the ways that matter." Something in Ferdinand's expression cracked open at that. Not sadness exactly, something closer to relief. The specific relief of being told, plainly, by someone with no reason to flatter him, that the thing he feared most about himself wasn't yet true. He reached up slowly, giving her every chance to step back. and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the size and strength of him. Jade did not step back. Her breath caught instead, sharp and unmistakable, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the space between them charged with something neither had quite dared to name yet. "Jade," he said, low, rough at the edges. "Ferdinand." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Whatever might have happened next was interrupted, as these things so often are, by the library door banging open and Garrick himself stepping through it, already mid-sentence about a delayed grain shipment, before he registered the scene in front of him and stopped dead in the doorway. A long, deeply uncomfortable silence followed. "I'll come back," Garrick said finally, with the strained dignity of a man pretending very hard he hadn't seen anything worth commenting on, and retreated the way he'd come, the door clicking shut rather more firmly than necessary behind him. Ferdinand let out a breath that was half laugh, half groan, dropping his forehead briefly against his palm. "That man has the worst timing of anyone I have ever known in my very long life." "Or the best," Jade said, feeling laughter bubble up unexpectedly through the lingering charge in the air. "Depending entirely on how you feel about whatever was about to happen." Ferdinand lifted his head, amber eyes finding hers again, and this time there was no mistaking the warmth in them, unguarded in a way she hadn't yet seen from him. "I feel," he said slowly, deliberately, "that Garrick and I are going to be having several extremely awkward conversations in the very near future." "Only several?" "I'm an optimist," he said, and this time when he reached for her hand, she let him take it, let her fingers curl into his without hesitation, some small stubborn hope in her chest daring, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to believe it might be allowed to stay. Garrick did not bring up what he'd witnessed in the library, which somehow made the awkwardness worse rather than better. For 3 full days he addressed Jade with a stiff, overcorrected politeness that felt like being handled with tongs, and addressed Ferdinand with the particular clipped efficiency of a man determined to prove that nothing whatsoever had changed between them. "Thank you very much." It was Marin who finally lost patience with the whole charade, cornering Garrick in the hallway outside the council chamber with a tray of tea she clearly had no intention of actually delivering anywhere. "You've been walking around like you swallowed a fence post," she informed him, not unkindly, in the tone of someone who had known him 30 years and had long since stopped being intimidated by his rank. "Say what you're going to say, Garrick, before you strain something important." Jade, who had been passing the corridor with an armful of sprites and no intention of eavesdropping, though the corridor's acoustics made eavesdropping nearly unavoidable, paused just out of sight, Thorn going very still against her shoulder as though he too understood the moment called for stillness. "I don't dislike her," Garrick said finally, gruff and reluctant, like each word cost him something. "That's not, Marin, that's not what this is. I watched that boy's father spend 30 years choosing feelings over fortifications, and I buried good soldiers because of borders that should have been secured a decade before they were breached. I am not eager to watch the son repeat it." "Nobody's asking you to be eager," Marin said, gentler now, "only to notice the difference between a boy chasing feelings instead of duty, and a king who's finally decided duty doesn't have to mean choosing loneliness. Those aren't the same thing, Garrick, whatever your old wounds keep telling you they are." There was a long pause. "She's not what I expected," Garrick admitted finally, grudging. "I'll grant her that much. Watched her stand in front of that gate merchant's offer without so much as blinking. 5 sprites and no bond mark, and no army behind her, telling a man twice her size he'd have to go through her first. That's not nothing." Another pause. Longer. "Doesn't mean I trust it yet, but I'll grant it's not nothing." Jade slipped away before either of them noticed her, chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Not quite forgiveness for Garrick's earlier coldness, not quite comfort either, but something adjacent to both. Not nothing. It would have to be enough for now. The real trouble arrived 3 days later, and not from Garrick at all. It began with Cedar refusing to eat, curling into a tight, listless ball in the corner of the tower room, and ignoring even Osric's honey biscuits, which had never once in 11 weeks failed to rouse him. By evening, Dew had grown quiet too, pressed close against her brother's side, both of them shivering despite the warm fire Jade had built up twice already. "Something's wrong," Jade said, panic climbing fast and sharp in her throat as she knelt beside them, feeling Cedar's small chest rise and fall too quickly beneath her palm. "Marin, something is wrong with them." Marin's face, when she examined the pair by candlelight, went carefully, deliberately neutral, in a way that frightened Jade more than any visible alarm could have. "Fetch His Majesty," she said quietly to the servant hovering in the doorway. "Now, girl, not after you've finished whatever you were doing." Ferdinand arrived within minutes, still half-dressed from having clearly been roused from sleep, and the sight of his face going tight and grave as he knelt beside the trembling sprites did nothing to steady Jade's racing heart. "They're fading," he said quietly, after a long moment of studying them, voice carefully controlled in a way that told Jade he was working hard to keep it that way. "I've seen it once before, years ago, in an older sprite separated too long from its bonded hollow tree. Moon hollow sprites root themselves to a place, Jade, not just any place, a place their instincts have marked as home. If that bond is broken too suddenly or never properly forms at all, they simply—" He hesitated. "They simply what?" Jade demanded, though some cold, sinking part of her had already guessed the answer. "They fade," he said finally. "The oldest texts call it hollow grief. A sprite untethered from a true home doesn't merely sicken, it forgets slowly how to want to keep living at all." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Jade's knees. "But they have a home. They have me. You are not a place, Jade, however much they love you." Ferdinand's voice was gentle but unflinching, the voice of a man delivering hard truth because kindness required nothing less. Sprites bond to soil and roots and stone as much as to people. They need a hollow of their own to root into, a true den, claimed and consecrated by their own small magic, not simply a borrowed tower room in a castle they know, on some instinctive level, isn't permanently theirs. "Then we find them one," Jade said immediately, fierce and unyielding, already rising to her feet. "Tonight. Wherever it takes, whatever it takes, I am not losing them to something we can fix." Something flickered across Ferdinand's face. Not doubt, she realized, but something closer to recognition, as though her fierceness had struck some private chord in him. "There's an old hollow oak grove at the edge of the western wood," he said slowly. "Sacred ground, technically, claimed by the old pact magic that binds this territory, meant for creatures the land itself judges worth protecting. I haven't set foot there in years, not since my father's death. Will it work? I don't know," he admitted, "but I know of nowhere else in this entire territory more likely to hold the kind of magic that might." They left within the hour, Jade cradling all 5 sprites bundled tightly against the night chill, Ferdinand leading them on foot through moonlit forest paths grown wild with disuse, until the trees around them changed, grew older, thicker, their bark pale as bone in the moonlight, roots arching up out of the earth like the ribs of some vast sleeping creature. The grove, when they reached it, took Jade's breath away entirely. Ancient oaks ringed a small clearing where soft blue-white light seemed to rise directly from the moss underfoot, and the air itself hummed faintly, alive with old magic that raised the fine hairs along her arms. "This is it," Ferdinand said quietly, something reverent and pained moving across his face in equal measure. "My father brought me here once, as a boy, told me this grove chooses who it protects. I haven't been able to make myself return since he passed." Jade knelt at the clearing's center, laying the sprites gently down upon the glowing moss, and for one agonizing moment, nothing happened at all. Cedar's small chest continued its too shallow rise and fall. Dew did not stir. Please, Jade whispered to the grove, to the old magic, to whatever ancient thing might be listening. They didn't choose to be unwanted anywhere else. Please don't let this be one more place that decides they don't belong. The moss beneath the sprites began, slowly, to glow brighter. A soft, pulsing, blue-white light that spread outward from where their small bodies lay, climbing up through exposed roots and ancient bark until the entire grove seemed to breathe with it. Cedar's eyes fluttered open. Dew let out a small, hiccuping breath that turned unmistakably into a yawn. Jade's own breath left her in a rush of pure relief, tears she hadn't noticed gathering finally spilling over as all 5 sprites stirred, stretched, and began, with the particular resilience of very young creatures freshly relieved of mortal danger, investigating the glowing moss with immediate, undignified enthusiasm. It chose them, Ferdinand said softly, wonder plain in his voice as he knelt beside her, watching the grove's light settle into a gentle, steady pulse around the small creatures now happily tumbling across the moss. Jade, this grove hasn't claimed anything new in over a decade. Not since before my father died. What does that mean? It means, he said, turning to look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch all over again, moonlight and old magic tangled together in his amber eyes. That this land has decided, on its own ancient terms, that you and everything you carry with you belong here. That's not a small thing, Jade. The packed magic of this grove doesn't extend that kind of welcome lightly. Jade looked around at the glowing clearing, at her small chosen family finally safe and settling into soil that had, impossibly, chosen them back, and felt something long-held and defensive finally begin to loosen in her chest. I didn't think anywhere would ever choose me, she admitted quietly. Not after the Great Hall. Ferdinand reached for her hand again, steady and sure in the pulsing blue-white light. Then let this be the place that proves the Great Hall wrong, he said. Let it be the first of many. Above them, the ancient oaks rustled softly in a wind that carried no chill at all. And for the first time since she'd fled into the dark 11 weeks before, Jade allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to believe she might actually be home. The weeks that followed the grove's blessing settled into something Jade had never quite dared imagine for herself. A rhythm. Mornings in the garden with dirt beneath her nails. Afternoons in the kitchen dodging Osric's good-natured complaints, while Thorne inevitably claimed whatever baked good had just left the oven. Evenings in the western grove, watching her 5 sprites grow bolder and stranger and more clearly themselves with each passing day, their moonlight fur settling into permanent, unique patterns now that they'd properly rooted. Cedars gone a deep, steady silver, saffrons shot through with faint threads of gold that Osric swore came from too many stolen honey biscuits. And Ferdinand, who found reasons to seek her out that grew less convincingly related to sprites or grain tithes with each passing week, until neither of them bothered pretending the reasons mattered at all. It was, Jade thought more than once, dangerously easy to let herself believe this could simply continue. That the Great Hall and its verdict might fade, eventually, into something that had happened to a different girl in a different life. She should have known better. Good things, as Marin liked to say, rarely came without something older and hungrier trailing behind them. The messenger arrived on a gray afternoon, thick with the smell of coming rain, travel-worn and out of breath, bearing a sealed letter that made Ferdinand's face go carefully, dangerously blank the moment he broke the wax. "What is it?" Jade asked, from where she'd been helping Marin sort dried herbs in the kitchen. Sprites scattered around her feet in various states of investigating a basket of lavender. "The Ashvale pack," Ferdinand said, voice tight. "Lady Ilsevet's father has taken ill. Gravely, from the sound of it. The Eastern Border Patrols report movement along the boundary lines. Unauthorized, unclaimed wolves testing the edges of Ashvale territory, likely hoping to seize ground while the old lord's attention is elsewhere." "That's not our territory," Jade said carefully. though something in Ferdinand's expression told her the matter was not so simple. No, but it borders ours, and if the Ashvale lands fall into disorder, whoever seizes them won't stop conveniently at the old boundary line. He set the letter down, jaw tight. Garrick's right that the alliance matters, whatever else is true. A weakened eastern border doesn't just threaten the Ashvale pack. It threatens every pack behind it, mine included. Garrick, summoned within the hour, did not bother hiding his grim satisfaction at being proven right, though to his credit, he also didn't gloat about it, merely laid out the strategic reality with the same flat, careful precision he brought to every council matter. Lord Ashvale has sent formal word requesting your Majesty's presence, and Lady Ilsevet's hand, should the old lord not recover, would secure the alliance permanently rather than leaving it to whatever heir might contest it after his passing. I know the timing is— He glanced briefly, almost apologetically, toward Jade. Unwelcome. But the offer stands regardless of anyone's personal preference, Your Majesty. 700 fields worth of grain and an entire eastern border's worth of safety don't much care about timing. The room felt suddenly very cold. Jade said nothing, watching Ferdinand's face carefully, feeling something old and familiar rise in her chest, the particular practiced numbness of a girl who had learned, long before tonight, exactly how these conversations tended to end for people like her. I need to go to the Ashvale lands, Ferdinand said finally, and though his eyes found Jade's as he said it, there was no comfort in them, only the grim weight of a king doing arithmetic he clearly hated. Not to agree to anything, but a king who ignores a neighboring lord's illness and a threatened border to avoid an uncomfortable conversation isn't much of a king at all. I understand, Jade said, and mostly, she did. Understood the duty, the weight of 700 fields, the impossible math of a border that didn't care whose heart it inconvenienced. What she understood less well, watching him prepare to leave the following morning, was the cold, quiet fear settling into her chest. That duty, once it demanded enough, had a way of rearranging even the truest of hearts around its own necessities. He was gone 11 days. Jade filled them the only way she knew how, burying herself in the garden until her hands ached, sitting with the sprites in the grove until the moonlight moss glow felt like the only steady thing left in her world, listening to Marin's careful, worried updates relayed secondhand through messengers who arrived with increasingly complicated news. Lord Ashvale, it emerged, had not merely fallen ill, he had died, 6 days into Ferdinand's visit, leaving Lady Ilsevet the sole heir to a territory now dangerously exposed on every border. The unauthorized wolves along the boundary had grown bolder in the chaos of mourning and succession, and word came back that Ferdinand had personally led a small force to drive them off, that there had been a skirmish. No deaths, thankfully, though several injuries, and that Lady Ilsevet herself had fought alongside him, sword in hand, fierce and capable in a way that made something small and ugly twist in Jade's chest despite every effort to be reasonable about it. She sounds, Jade said carefully to Marin on the 9th day, unable to keep the strain entirely out of her voice, like exactly the sort of match Garrick's been arguing for all along. Marin, kneading bread dough with rather more force than the recipe strictly required, didn't look up. She sounds, she corrected, like a young woman who just lost her father and is trying to hold together a territory suddenly balanced entirely on her shoulders. That's not the same as being anyone's match, girl, however convenient the timing looks from where you're standing. I know that. Jade pressed her palms flat against the work table, steadying herself. I do know that, Marin. It's only— She exhaled, frustrated with herself. It's hard not to feel like the girl the Great Hall called unworthy 11 weeks ago, watching a capable sword-wielding lady handle an actual crisis at his side while I sit here tending herbs and worrying. Tending herbs and worrying, and keeping 5 living creatures alive and rooted and safe when nobody else in this territory knew the first thing about doing it, Marin said sharply, setting down the dough to fix Jade with a look that brooked no argument. Different kinds of strength, girl. The kind that swings a sword in a crisis, and the kind that sits patient through 11 long days of not knowing, holding steady for 5 small lives who'd fall apart without you, and doesn't once run from the fear eating at her chest even when it would be easier to. I've watched both kinds up close in my life. I'll not have you deciding yours is the lesser one just because it's quieter. Jade didn't have a ready answer for that, and Marin, with the particular mercy of a woman who understood when a point had landed well enough to be left alone, returned to her bread without pressing further. Ferdinand returned on the 12th day, road-worn and grim, a shallow but visible wound healing along his jaw that made Jade's stomach drop the moment she saw him ride through the gate. She was at his side before she'd fully decided to move, hands hovering uncertainly near the injury before he caught them gently in his own. "I'm all right," he said, low, exhausted. "It looks worse than it is." "What happened?" "The border's secured, for now. The wolves testing it thought a leaderless territory would be easy pickings. They were wrong, though it cost more than I'd have liked to prove it." His grip on her hands tightened, and something in his exhausted face shifted, softened, became almost desperate in its focus on her. "Jade, Ilsevet asked me, formally, before the full Ashvale court, to consider the alliance marriage after her mourning period ends. Said it plainly, in front of witnesses, the way custom demands." Jade felt the floor tilt beneath her, the fear she'd spent 11 days trying to reason away finally arriving in full, unbearable weight. "And what did you say?" Ferdinand's thumb traced slow, absent circles against the back of her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "I told her the truth," he said quietly. "That I respect her and grieve for her loss, and will stand as her ally against any threat to her borders for as long as I live and breathe, and that my heart is already claimed, entirely and without reservation, by someone 11 days' hard ride away who spent this entire crisis worrying herself sick over a king who never once, not for a single moment, stopped thinking of her." The relief that broke through Jade's chest was so sudden and complete it nearly buckled her knees. "Ferdinand!" "I'm not finished," he said, though his voice had gone rough, urgent. "Ilsevet took it better than Garrick will, I expect. She's practical enough to understand a forced alliance built on a divided heart serves nobody well, whatever the arithmetic says. But Garrick..." He exhaled hard. "Garrick is going to be considerably less reasonable about it, Jade, and I need you to know that whatever storm comes from the council over this decision, I chose it with clear eyes. I chose you. Not because some old grove magic decided you belonged here. Because I have never, in 6 years of ruling alone under my father's shadow, felt half so certain of anything as I feel certain of that." Jade didn't trust her voice to answer properly, so she answered instead by closing the last small distance between them, rising onto her toes and kissing him, fierce and certain and 11 days overdue, feeling him respond immediately, one arm sliding around her waist to pull her close, as though he'd been waiting exactly as long to do the same. It was, she would think later, the first moment in her entire life she had felt herself entirely, unmistakably chosen, not despite her strangeness, not in spite of some absence in her, but simply and completely for exactly who she was. She should have known, given everything the Great Hall had taught her about how quickly good things could sour, that the storm Ferdinand had warned her about was already gathering, closer and far more dangerous than either of them yet understood. The storm broke 3 days later, and it came, as these things so often do, from a direction Jade hadn't thought to guard against at all. It began innocently enough, a formal council session called to address the aftermath of the Ashvale crisis, routine business about border patrols and supply lines that Jade had no particular reason to attend. She was in the garden when Marin found her, face drawn tight with an urgency that made Jade's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. "You need to come," Marin said. "Now. Garrick's brought something before the full council, and it concerns you directly." The council chamber, when Jade arrived, was thick with tension. Every eldest advisor seated in grim silence around the long table, while Garrick stood at its head, a weathered scroll unrolled before him. Ferdinand sat rigid in the king's chair, jaw set in a way Jade had never seen before. And something in his expression, not anger exactly, something closer to dread, made her chest tighten before she'd even crossed the threshold. "Ah," Garrick said as she entered, his voice carefully neutral in a way that fooled no one. "Good. This concerns you, so you should hear it directly rather than secondhand." "Hear what?" Jade asked, though some old, familiar instinct was already bracing her for the worst. "I took the liberty," Garrick said, "of making inquiries into your former pack. After the merchant incident made me curious about exactly what kind of trouble might follow a stray with no bond mark and no declared gift into the king's own household. What I found is somewhat more complicated than a simple rejection ceremony." He unrolled the scroll further, and Jade felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized her pack's official seal. "Your pack's records," Garrick continued, relentless, "indicate the council's decision to release you wasn't merely about an absent bond mark, as you led everyone here to believe. There's mention of a prophecy, old, half-forgotten, rarely spoken of even within your own pack, concerning an unmarked wolf who would one day draw down ruin upon whatever territory sheltered her. Your elders didn't simply find you unremarkable, Lady Jade. They found you dangerous enough to cast out entirely, rather than risk keeping such a prophecy anywhere near their own borders." The chamber went utterly silent. Jade felt every eye in the room turn to her, and for one sickening moment she was back in the Great Hall, the weight of collective judgment pressing down on her chest exactly as it had 11 weeks before. "I've never heard of any prophecy," she said. And it was the truth, raw and unguarded. "Nobody ever told me that. They told me I had no bond, no gift. That's all they told me." "Perhaps," Garrick said, not unkindly, though the words landed like blows regardless, "because a pack ashamed of casting out a girl for something as small as an absent bond mark might prefer that story to the alternative, being unable to control or contain whatever the prophecy actually describes." "Enough." Ferdinand's voice cut through the chamber like a blade, sharp and final. "Garrick, you will not stand in my council chamber and recite half-remembered pack superstition as though it constitutes evidence of anything." "I would remind your majesty," Garrick said, and for the first time Jade heard something almost pleading beneath his usual gruff formality, "that I have spent 30 years watching this kingdom weather threats that began exactly this way, dismissed as superstition, until they weren't. I am not accusing Lady Jade of malice. I don't believe for one moment she means this territory harm, but belief and truth aren't always the same creature, and a king blinded by his own heart has led kingdoms to ruin before. I would be failing every duty I hold if I did not bring this before the council the moment I found it." The room held its breath. Jade looked at Ferdinand, searching his face for some sign of doubt, some crack in his certainty, and found, to her enormous relief and equally enormous terror, that his expression hadn't wavered at all. "I don't care what half-forgotten prophecy some frightened pack elders invented to justify their own cruelty," Ferdinand said, voice hard as stone. "I have watched this woman heal broken creatures nobody else thought worth saving. I have watched her stand against a slave merchant without flinching, and comfort a household staff that adopted her as fiercely as any blood family within weeks of her arrival. And I have watched an ancient grove untouched by new magic in over a decade choose to claim her without hesitation. If that's what ruin looks like, Garrick, then I welcome it with open arms." "With respect, Your Majesty," Garrick said, low. "That's precisely the kind of blind certainty I've watched destroy kingdoms before." Something in Ferdinand's composure finally cracked, just slightly, exhaustion and frustration bleeding through the careful royal control. "Then what would you have me do, Garrick? Cast her out on the strength of a rumor from a pack that already proved themselves unworthy of keeping her?" Abandon the first thing in 6 years of ruling alone that has ever felt like it might actually be mine. Because some frightened old men once whispered a word they never even bothered explaining to the girl it concerned? I would have you investigate, Garrick said, steady despite the king's raised voice. Before you commit this entire territory's safety to certainty you haven't yet earned. That is all I have ever asked, Your Majesty. Not that you abandon her. Only that you look before you leap so far you cannot see the ground beneath you anymore. The chamber fell into heavy silence. Jade, standing frozen at its center, felt something old and familiar rising in her throat, the specific, practiced instinct of a girl who had learned, long ago, that when a room full of powerful people began weighing her worth against their fears, the safest thing to do was disappear quietly before they finished deciding. I need air, she said, voice unsteady, and left before anyone could stop her. She found herself, inevitably, in the Western Grove, sprites gathering around her the moment she sank down onto the moonlit moss, sensing without needing to be told that something in their small chosen family had gone badly wrong. Saffron climbed into her lap immediately, pressing close, while Fern paced an anxious circle around her feet. She did not hear Ferdinand approach until he was already kneeling beside her, breathing hard, as though he'd run the entire distance from the castle. Jade, is it true? She asked, not looking at him, staring instead at the pulsing blue-white moss beneath her hands. Was there really a prophecy? Is that actually why they cast me out? I don't know, Ferdinand admitted, and she appreciated, even through her fear, that he didn't lie to spare her feelings. Garrick's scroll is old, and half its language is corrupted with age. It could mean anything, or nothing at all. Old pack prophecies are rarely as literal as frightened elders make them sound. But it could be true? It could. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it, though her fingers trembled in his grip. Jade, listen to me. I don't care what that scroll says. I have spent 6 years learning exactly how much damage a council's fear can do when left unchecked, watching my father let other men's caution decide things that should have belonged to his own heart. I am not going to make that same mistake. Garrick's not wrong to be afraid, Jade said quietly. He's spent 30 years protecting this kingdom. He's watched real threats hide behind exactly this kind of dismissal before. I understand why he's frightened. I understand it better than I want to. Understanding his fear doesn't mean surrendering to it. No, she agreed. But it also doesn't mean I get to simply demand everyone trust me on faith, when even I don't know what that prophecy actually says about what I am. She finally looked at him, eyes bright with unshed tears she refused, this time, to let fall. I spent 19 years being told I was nothing, Ferdinand. Do you have any idea what it's like to suddenly be told instead that maybe I'm something far worse? Ferdinand's hand tightened around hers, fierce and certain. I have an idea of exactly one thing, he said. That whatever that scroll claims, and whatever Garrick fears, I have watched who you actually are for 11 weeks now, with my own eyes, without a single prophecy's help. You are not ruined, Jade. You are the first true thing this territory has claimed in over a decade. I trust that. Fully. Whatever it costs me with my counsel. And if it costs you your kingdom? The question hung heavy in the moonlit air between them, and Ferdinand did not answer immediately. Did not, Jade noted with a fresh ache in her chest, rush to promise something he wasn't certain he could deliver. I don't know, he admitted finally, low and honest. I hope it never comes to that choice. But I know which way I'd choose, if it did, and I'd rather you hear that plainly from me now than discover it too late to matter. It should have comforted her more than it did. Instead, watching the grim, determined set of his jaw, Jade felt the full weight of what she might be asking of him. A kingdom's trust, a council's loyalty, the delicate balance of 6 hard-won years of rule. All of it suddenly balanced precariously on the strength of a scroll neither of them could fully read. And a prophecy that might, for all either of them knew, Prove every one of Garrick's worst fears exactly right. For the first time since the Grove had claimed her sprites, and in its own quiet way, claimed her too, Jade found herself wondering if the kindest thing she could do for everyone she'd come to love in this strange, unlikely home might be to leave it before that prophecy had the chance to prove itself true. She left before dawn, while the castle still slept and the sprites lay curled together in the Grove's protective glow, safe now on their own claimed ground, even without her beside them. It was, Jade told herself, the one true mercy she could still offer. That whatever came of the prophecy, whatever storm gathered around her name, her small chosen family would remain rooted here, sheltered by magic that had chosen them long before it had ever fully chosen her. She left a letter for Ferdinand, brief and unsteady, folded on the pillow where he would find it too late to stop her. I won't be the reason you lose what 6 years of careful ruling built. I won't be the thing that finally proves your father's mistakes right. Please look after them. Please don't let this be what you remember about me. The forest at dawn looked nothing like it had the night she'd first fled into it. Softer, grayer. Mist curling low between trunks she now recognized. Paths she'd walked a dozen times in the months since the council first branded her astray. It was strange, she thought, how quickly foreign had become familiar. How thoroughly this territory had settled itself beneath her skin without her fully noticing until the moment she was leaving it behind. She made it perhaps 3 miles before the ground behind her thundered with the unmistakable weight of a very large wolf running very fast. Jade! She didn't stop, not at first, some stubborn, self-punishing part of her certain that stopping would only make the leaving harder. But Ferdinand's voice carried an urgency that finally broke through her resolve, and she turned in time to see him shift mid-stride, fur rippling back into the tall, dark-haired man who caught her by the shoulders with hands that trembled, whether from the run or from something rawer, she couldn't tell. You left, he said, breathless, something close to anguish in his voice. You left a letter, Jade, like I was a debt you needed settling before you could leave in good conscience. I couldn't let Garrick be right, she said, tears finally breaking free despite every effort to hold them back. I couldn't be the reason 6 years of your careful ruling fell apart over a prophecy neither of us even understands. Garrick isn't right, Ferdinand said fiercely, pulling her closer. Jade, listen to me. After you left the chamber last night, I spent 3 hours going through every text in this castle's archive with him. Every scrap of pack lore, every old prophecy record we could find. We found the original source of that prophecy, the full text, not the corrupted fragment Garrick first uncovered. And it doesn't say what he feared it said. Ferdinand's hands cupped her face, urgent, certain. The prophecy doesn't name an unmarked wolf who brings ruin. It names an unmarked wolf who breaks something. An old, rigid pattern of judging worth by bond marks and battle gifts alone. A pattern that's cost countless packs their best members over generations of narrow-minded elders too afraid to look past tradition. It's not a warning, Jade. It's a promise. That someone would come who the old rules couldn't measure, and that her arrival would force everyone around her to finally ask better questions about what worth actually means. Jade's breath caught, disbelief and dawning hope warring in her chest. That's not ruin at all. No, Ferdinand said, voice breaking slightly with the force of his relief. It's the opposite. Garrick read it himself, once we found the full text. He came to find me at dawn, before I even knew you'd gone, to apologize. Properly, not just formally. Said 30 years of watching threats hide as harmless things had made him forget how to recognize a genuine gift hiding as something the old rules simply didn't have language for yet. He said that? Gruffly, and with considerable embarrassment, but yes. A ghost of a smile broke through Ferdinand's urgency. He also said, and I quote, that any woman capable of making a king run 3 miles through a forest at dawn without his boots on had probably earned the benefit of the doubt, regardless of what any old scroll claimed. Jade looked down, for the first time, at Ferdinand's bare feet, mud-streaked and clearly unprepared for a forest floor, and felt a laugh break free through her tears despite everything. "You ran after me without your boots?" "I would have run after you without considerably more than my boots, if the situation required it," Ferdinand said, entirely serious despite her laughter, pulling her fully against him. "Jade, I told you once that I'd rather fail trying to be the kind of king who refuses to sell out trusting creatures for gold than succeed at being the kind who doesn't. The same is true here, 100 times over. I would rather fail at ruling perfectly and keep you beside me than succeed at every careful calculation Garrick's ever made and lose the first thing in 6 years that's made this crown feel like something worth wearing instead of something I merely inherited." "Ferdinand, I'm not finished," he said again, and this time when he reached into his coat pocket, his hands were shaking for an entirely different reason. He withdrew something small, wrapped in soft cloth, and unwrapped it with careful, deliberate hands to reveal a slender silver band, etched with a pattern Jade recognized after a moment's disbelief. The same faint, shifting silver lavender pattern of Moon Hollow fur. "Marin helped me commission it, the day after the Grove claimed your sprites," he admitted, something vulnerable breaking through his usual composure. "I've been carrying it for weeks, waiting for a moment that felt right. And then Garrick's scroll happened, and I thought perhaps I'd lost the chance to ever give it to you at all. I am not going to make that mistake twice." He met her eyes, steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Jade, whatever any prophecy claims about you, I know exactly one truth that matters more than any of it. I love you, not because some ancient grove chose you, not because of any prophecy old or new, but because of every unguarded, stubborn, fiercely gentle thing I've watched you do since the night you stood in my clearing with 2 frightened creatures in your arms and refused to leave them behind, even facing down a king. Stay. Not because leaving would break some old rule. Stay because this territory, and this king, are only truly home when you're in them." The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, mist curling gold now with the fully risen sun, and Jade, who had spent 19 years believing herself unworthy of exactly this kind of choosing, felt every last guarded piece of her heart finally, completely let go. "Yes," she said, through tears that had nothing left of sorrow in them at all. "Yes, I'll stay. I choose you too, Ferdinand. Not the crown, not the territory. You." He kissed her then, fierce and certain in the golden morning light, and somewhere behind them, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of 5 small, delighted chirrups, cedar and dew and thorn and fern and saffron, having apparently followed the scent of their favorite person through the forest at first light, now tumbling gleefully around the couple's feet, as though the entire dramatic morning had been arranged purely for their benefit. Ferdinand broke the kiss, laughing, resting his forehead against Jade's as Thorne attempted, with great determination and no success, to climb his leg. "It seems," he said, "we have witnesses." "They usually do," Jade said, gathering Saffron up against her chest with one arm while keeping her other hand firmly twined with Ferdinand's. "Have a habit of finding exactly where they're needed most." Behind them, the sun rose fully over the tree line, gilding the whole forest gold, and for the first time in her entire life, Jade walked back toward a home that had never once, not for a single moment, considered her anything other than exactly, perfectly wanted. 2 years later. The morning of the Western Grove Festival dawned clear and golden, and Jade stood at the edge of the very clearing where she had once knelt in desperate prayer over 2 failing sprites. watching now as the whole territory gathered beneath ancient oaks strung with ribbons and lanterns for a celebration that had, somehow, become the most beloved tradition of her husband's reign. "You're doing the thing again," Ferdinand murmured against her ear, arms sliding around her from behind as she watched the preparations unfold. "The thing where you look at all this like you still can't quite believe it's real. Can you blame me?" She leaned back against him, watching Osric argue cheerfully with a trio of children over whether the honey biscuits were, in fact, ready to be sampled yet, watching Marin direct the ribbon hanging with the same brisk, affectionate authority she brought to everything. 2 years ago, I was standing in a great hall being told I wasn't worth keeping. Now half this kingdom shows up every spring to celebrate the grove that claimed me. "Not just you," Ferdinand said, nodding toward the clearing's center, where a small crowd of children had gathered around a rather more expansive gathering of Moon Hollow sprites than 5. Nearly 20 now, descendants and newcomers both, drawn steadily to the grove and to the territory's growing reputation as a place that welcomed strange, overlooked things rather than casting them out. Cedar, gray-muzzled now but still spry, had taken up an unofficial position as elder statesman among the younger sprites, patiently tolerating the enthusiastic mauling of 3 sprite kits who'd clearly decided he made an excellent climbing structure. Dew had paired off in the peculiar way sprites did, with a shy newcomer who'd wandered in from the southern woods the previous autumn. The two of them curled together in dappled shade. Thorn, unsurprisingly, had stationed himself directly beside the biscuit table, and Fern stood sentry nearby with the same grave suspicion he'd once directed at Jade's tower fireplace, while Saffron slept, entirely unbothered by the festivities, draped across the lap of a small girl Jade recognized with a fond, familiar ache. "Is that Talia?" Ferdinand confirmed, following her gaze to where her sister sat cross-legged in the grass. Saffron sprawled contentedly across her knees, laughing at something one of the local children had said. "She's been coming every season since the reconciliation. I think she's grown rather attached." It had taken over a year, that reconciliation. Careful letters, a hesitant visit, Talia's own halting apology for years of silent complicity in a pack's cruelty she'd been too young and too frightened to challenge at the time. Their mother had never fully managed the same courage, though word came occasionally, secondhand, that she asked after Jade's well-being more than pride allowed her to say directly. Jade had made a fragile peace with that, the way she'd made peace with so much else, understanding finally that not every wound closed completely, and that the ones which didn't could still be lived around, rather than lived inside. "There's someone else waiting to see you," Ferdinand said, nodding toward the grove's entrance, where a young wolf shifter stood at its edge, dressed in traveling clothes, expression a careful mixture of hope and apprehension that Jade recognized immediately, painfully, from her own reflection 2 years before. She crossed to the newcomer without hesitation. The girl, no older than 16, Jade guessed, thin and travel-worn, flinched slightly as Jade approached, the particular flinch of someone long accustomed to being unwelcome. "I heard," the girl said, voice barely above a whisper, "that there's a place near here that doesn't turn away strays. I didn't know if it was true." "It's true," Jade said gently, and something in her own chest ached with fierce, protective recognition. "What's your name?" "Sable. My pack said I was—" The girl's voice cracked slightly. "Defective. No shift gift, not even a partial one. They said I'd never be more than a burden on the pack's resources." Jade felt the old, familiar sting of it, filtered now through 2 years of healing rather than fresh wound, and reached out to take the girl's trembling hand. "I was told something very similar once, in a hall not so different from wherever you came from," she said. "Come, there's a grove here that judges people rather differently than most packs do, And there's certainly a very stern housekeeper who will insist on feeding you properly before anyone discusses anything else important. As if summoned, Marin appeared at Jade's shoulder within moments, taking one look at Sable's thin frame and exhausted eyes, and clucking with immediate familiar disapproval. Well, don't just stand there letting the poor girl catch a chill. Kitchen, now. Osric's biscuits won't eat themselves, whatever Thorne seems to believe about his exclusive claim to them. Sable glanced uncertainly at Jade, and Jade offered the same steady, patient smile she'd once received from nobody at all in her first days here. The smile that said wordlessly, "You are allowed to stay exactly as long as you need, and there is no version of this welcome with strings attached." "Go on," Jade said softly. "I promise, this is a place that keeps its promises about welcome. I'm living proof." That evening, as the festival lanterns caught fire against a deepening violet sky, and the sprites settled into contented, sleepy piles beneath the grove's oldest oak, Jade found Ferdinand standing at the clearing's edge, watching Sable, already looking marginally less haunted after an afternoon of Osric's fussing and Marin's brisk, practical kindness, laugh quietly at something one of the local children had said. "Garrick asked me today," Ferdinand said, sliding an arm around her waist, "whether we might formalize something. A standing welcome, written into territorial law, for any wolf or creature cast out elsewhere for reasons that have nothing to do with actual danger or malice. Says it's good policy, apparently. Strengthens the territory's reputation, draws loyal, grateful subjects rather than merely fearful ones." "Garrick said that?" Jade asked, genuinely startled. "Garrick has become," Ferdinand said, with a fond, wry twist to his mouth, rather unexpectedly attached to the whole enterprise in his own gruff way. "I believe he's grown fond of being wrong about something, for once, and finding the truth turned out considerably better than his fears predicted." Jade looked out over the grove, over Sable's cautious, unfolding laughter, over Talia dozing beneath the oak with Saffron still curled in her lap, over 5 sprites who had once been strays exactly like herself, now surrounded by nearly 20 more who'd found the same unlikely welcome, and felt something in her chest settle fully, completely, into a peace she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. "I think," she said slowly, "that would be exactly right. There's one more thing," Ferdinand added, and something in his voice made her glance up sharply, catching the particular careful lightness he only used when trying to seem casual about something that wasn't casual at all. Marin mentioned, rather pointedly this morning, that the nursery wing has stood empty and unused for entirely too long. Given certain recent developments, she seemed rather smugly certain I hadn't yet noticed myself. Jade's breath caught. "Ferdinand." "I only mention it," he said, unable to fully hide his own growing smile, "because I happened to notice it too. Several weeks ago, in fact." Her hand found his, fingers interlacing with the same certainty they'd found 2 years before in a moonlit forest clearing, both of them laughing now, quiet and disbelieving and utterly, completely happy. "I suppose," Jade said, watching their strange, beloved, ever-growing family settle into the golden evening around them, sprites and sisters, gruff advisors turned quiet allies, frightened newcomers finding their first safe footing, and somewhere, impossibly, the beginning of something entirely new stirring beneath her own heart. The nursery wing has been empty for quite long enough. Above them, the last of the festival lanterns caught the breeze, sending soft golden light dancing across the ancient grove that had once, on a desperate moonlit night, chosen a rejected girl and a handful of forgotten creatures as exactly, perfectly worth keeping, and had never, not for one single day since, given either of them reason to doubt it. To whoever is listening tonight, if any part of this story found its way into your own chest, into your own scars, I'd love to hear which moment mattered most to you. Was it the humiliation in the great hall? The impossible gesture in the dark forest? The truth behind the prophecy? Or the quiet, golden peace of the ending? And if this kind of story, of rejection turned into belonging, of love that chooses rather than merely claims, is one you'd like to hear more of, let me know. There are always more strays out there, waiting for their own grove to claim them.